Africa. Sudan has been at war for a year. Fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces has reduced much of the capital to rubble and displaced millions of people. The country's citizens are now on the verge of a hunger crisis. Can this conflict end peacefully through negotiations?
I strongly believe the African Union and IGAD have to be in the lead to find a political solution.
Straight Talk Africa starts right now. Welcome to Straight Talk Africa, coming to you from VOA headquarters here in Washington. I'm Vincent McCory. Now, 1 year has passed since war broke out in Sudan, but we don't hear about it often in the news. Russia's war in Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas war are monopolizing the attention of the media. There seems to be a forgotten war that has displaced over 6.6 million people within Sudan, disrupted the country's economy, cut supply and aid lines, and is now pushing nearly 5 million people to the brink of famine. The conflict started with two military leaders competing for power, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, Sudanese president and chief of the armed forces, and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also referred to as Hameti, head of the paramilitary group Rapid Support Forces. Political observers see no end to the conflict and say the longer it drags on, the more likely Sudan will become a breeding ground for terrorist groups. VOA spoke to volunteers at one of the last functioning hospitals in Omdurman, and Wilkins reports.
From day one of Sudan's war a year ago, fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces has ravaged Sudan's twin cities of Khartoum, its capital, and Omdurman, its largest. Millions have fled the metropolitan area because of the fighting. Some have stayed, however, either because they don't have the means to leave, or in a few cases, because they chose to stay and help. Momin Ahmed Abbas volunteers at one of Omdurman's last functional hospitals and refuses to flee the city.
I cannot abandon them, especially when they rely on my support. Thus, I remain to ensure that injured individuals have access to essentials like food, shelter, and medical care. Leaving would only exacerbate the situation for those in need.
He says the situation is desperate at the hospital, which lacks medical supplies and security, and is vulnerable to frequent airstrikes and fighting. Humanitarian groups and international journalists have found entry into Khartoum and many other parts of Sudan all but impossible. And as a result, the world's awareness of the country's troubles has diminished. Commentators and diplomats often refer to Sudan's conflict as the world's forgotten war, despite as many as 16,000 people estimated to have died because of the conflict and 8.6 million forcibly displaced. Analysts say pressure from the international community is needed to bring the warring sides to the negotiating table. But one doesn't see that happening anytime soon.
Sadly, I don't see this conflict as particularly ripe for any kind of resolution right now. Both sides think either that they can win or they have to win. And as long as they continue to be sustained by external actors, providing them weapons and intelligence, then they're going to continue this fight.
A recent US intelligence report says the longer the war drags on, the more likely Sudan will become a breeding ground for terrorists. One analyst who spoke to VOA echoed this view.
You got young people, and they have all the fuel. They have the anger, they have the ethnic division, and then they have whatever is the narrative about there is a just war happening somewhere.
Leaders of both warring sides are wildly unpopular among most Sudanese. Neither has ever been democratically elected. Yet Sudanese civilians are the ones bearing the brunt of the ongoing fighting. Abbas says Sudan needs external help and intervention.
We desperately need international support to address the crisis in Sudan. Awareness must be raised about the ongoing suffering and devastation.
Yet, after 1 year of fighting in Sudan, it seems clear that no substantial help is on its way. Henry Wilkins, VOA News.
And Wilkins filed that report. Now, Kenyan President William Ruto visited the White House for a state visit at the invitation of President Joe Biden. VOA's Huba Abdi spoke to Ruto about his efforts to bring peace to Sudan.
We have a robust engagement, and as I have told you, in the Sudan, I had the former Prime Minister in Nairobi, together with others who are not signatories to the Juba Peace Agreement. They have now signed what they called a Nairobi Agreement to bring together different teams of civil society, of political parties, to be able to think about how they can add the impetus to stopping the war in Sudan and providing a mechanism that eventually will install a civilian administration in Sudan. So those efforts are underway, and we have taken the very firm position that the same way Kenya took a position, IGAD also took a position that we must talk to both sides. We must talk to the Al-Burhan, the SAF side. We must talk to the RSF side, because in peacemaking, you don't talk to friends, you talk to enemies. That's how to make peace. And therefore, we have to talk to both sides. I think when IGAD asked both sides to come for an IGAD meeting, Hemedi showed up. Burhan showed up in one meeting. And then in the next meeting, Hemedi showed up. When Hemedi showed up, the other side says they are pulling out of IGAD because the other side showed up. It is the only way we are going to make peace. This is not the time for sides to decide who talks to who. This is the time for the sides involved in the carnage, in the destruction, in the killings that are going on in Sudan. This is the time for the sides to stop. And they should be the last ones, trying to point fingers this way or that way. We want them to come to the table. We want them to participate in a process. We believe that there is no military solution to the challenge and to the problem we have in Sudan. There is only one chance, and that is through dialogue. And we want to make it a Sudanese conversation led by Sudanese, an inclusive process that it's not limited to military competence. We must have women, we must have civil society, we must have political parties participating, because that's the only chance we have to make peace.
Well, that was Kenyan President William Ruto talking to VOA during his visit to Washington. Now, the international community is making a big effort to bring the warring sides to the negotiation table. I talked to the European Union Special Representative for the Horn of Africa, Annette Weber, and I asked her if there is a possibility for the international community, including the West Africa, the Middle East, that are involved in Sudan, to agree on a path that can bring peace to the East African nation.
If you would have asked me this question about a year ago, I would have said after the Pretoria Peace Agreement on Ethiopia, there's a consolidation. People are, it's toning down, it's settling, it's consolidating. Now we see the opposite. Now with the war in Sudan starting 15th of April last year, the whole region is in total turmoil, and we don't see an end of the war in Sudan. I think we see a bit of a movement on the civilian side, but the belligerents are clear that they want to win militarily. But of course, Sudan is not just staying in Sudan. It has impacts on South Sudan, on Chad, on the whole neighborhood. I think, yes, the peace is holding in Ethiopia. However, of course, you have other regions in Ethiopia, Amhara region, Oromo region, that are not so peaceful and quiet. There is a lot of longing by the people in the Horn to really overcome these conflicts, to consolidate, to have, basically responsible governments, to have a region that can feed itself, a region that can bring their own security. But at the moment, we're really far from that.
Do we have the ability given all the organizations that have focused there, do we have the ability to actually get that together, get the region to a point where there can be, if not real peace, but some semblance of peace, so people can actually exist in a sense of, with hope and security?
I think the ability is there. I think there is, it should be possible. I think we've seen that throughout the years when the region, IGAD, other organizations were reacting to conflicts, coming together as a region. We've seen that in South Sudan. If the region finds its way and agrees on the direction, the region can do everything. But right now, I think we really also have, the lack of political will of some of the leaders, including the two belligerents, to look at the greater good, to look at the situation of their people, of their population. We have the most brutal war and the biggest humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan. I mean, 7 million people are displaced, 7 million. It's unbelievable. We don't have humanitarian access to many of the people, even inside of the capital. So that really takes political will on the side of the belligerents to sit down and negotiate. I think the region has so much potential. It has the potential for peace, it has the potential for, economic prosperity, but it really takes the region to act as a region.
Sometimes one wonders, is there confusion as to who the warring sides, the belligerents, are talking to and who they're listening to? We have the African Union, we have the EU, we have IGAD, we have the East African Community. The United States has so many times gone around the area to try and talk to these sides and even call some of them over here. The question is, who is talking to who? Who is listening to who?
I think we need to be much stronger in sending one collective message as the international community. Right now, I think in the case of Sudan, we had various different messages sent, from the Gulf, from the AU, from the international community and the UN. I think now we're getting closer to sending one message, that is, stop the war, come to a ceasefire, and allow humanitarian access. I think on this we can all agree. Whom do they listen to? I think there is leverage from all of us if we act collectively. I think if we act one by one, I think the two belligerents in Sudan have learned in the last 30 years under Bashir that they can survive even, if they are sanctioned, if they're in full isolation. But that's not the case for prosperous Sudan. That's not the case for Sudan with the aspiration to become a democratic Sudan. This democratic Sudan that needs the region, that needs the environment, it needs the neighborhood, it needs all of us to support that. And I think this is really, where we need to get better. We need to send one message with one united voice, together with the Sudanese civilians.
The two generals, some people say there are forces behind them, or there are those who support the different sides. Is the EU, are the other powerful entities, including the United Nations, reaching out to those who are behind, these generals, who are supporting them, their own individual agendas within Sudan?
Yes, I mean, we speak to everyone, and I think what we can see right now, the framework for negotiations has been in the discussion to be enlarged by those who have more leverage on the two generals, who are basically closer to the two generals, to the respective sides of the two sides of the war. And I think that would be the right idea, to have the Jeddah negotiations not just between the Saudi and the Americans, but to include the African Union, to include the Egyptians on the one hand and the Emiratis on the other hand. And I think that would bring basically everyone that matters to get the right pressure to the two generals. However, I think we all need to agree what is the objective. And I think, again, if we can agree on the objective, ceasefire and humanitarian access for everyone, I think then that could be the right pressure. But we're not there.
If you think about the European Union, for example, in the entire European region, if there was a conflict between two countries, you'll expect, the European Union will come together and summon those entities and talk about the way forward and the best way to deal with that conflict. People keep wondering, why is it almost impossible for, say, the African Union to just deal with their own issues rather than wait for the EU or some other external entities to come and try to mediate between two warring sides? From your working on the continent working on these issues, what has made it so hard for those Africa-based, organization to resolve those local conflicts?
I mean, that's, of course, a great question for the African Union. But I have to say, I mean, just a week after the war started in Sudan, the African Union called for the first very inclusive meeting and showed that they have the pull, that they could, I mean, Guterres, everyone was there for a couple of hours discussing Sudan. I think the convening power is there. We as EU have always said what we believe strongly, and you just mentioned it. Without the region, you cannot find lasting peace. The neighbors have to be convinced. The neighbors have to be in the driver's seat. Of course, the Sudanese have to really, be basically the drivers. So I believe it's been crucial and existential for these conflicts to be solved in support by the neighborhood. If it's IGAD plus AU, if it's the African Union. We now have reached a point where the African Union has installed a high-level panel where we have basically a functioning panel on the African side that is mandated by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union to move, to really negotiate and mediate on their behalf. And I think this is, maybe a bit late, but it's happening now. And I think this is really what counts and what matters right now. Again, how do we get this together with the existing formats that we have in Jeddah and Saudi Arabia, that we have, with the Neighborhood Initiative in Egypt? I think right now is really the question, who can coordinate between these initiatives? I strongly believe the African Union and IGAD have to be in the lead to find a political solution. But I think also if a ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire can be reached in Jeddah, that shouldn't be a stumbling block. It should actually be just coming together. So I think that really would be the ideal way to go about this. But we have to go in one direction. We have to send the same message.
Well, that was Annette Weber, European Union Special Representative for the Horn of Africa. It's time now for a break. And when we come back, we'll take a closer look at the humanitarian crisis in Sudan. Stay with us.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.
Did you know that Africa has the highest rate of suicide? And although men are more likely to commit suicide, the rate for women has risen significantly over the past several years, according to the World Health Organization. This week in Our Voices, we'll try to understand why suicide is on the rise and learn what role we can play to prevent it. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Moudou, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
After more than a year of conflict, the people of Sudan are trapped in an inferno of brutal violence. Famine is closing in. Diseases are closing in. The fighting is closing in. And there's no end in sight.
Well, almost 9 million people, according to the United Nations, have been forced to flee to other parts of Sudan or neighboring countries. The United Nations noted that humanitarian operations will take place against the backdrop of an imminent rainy season, with roads becoming impassable in June and July. There is impending threat of famine. Let's take a look at two maps here. First, in red, are areas experiencing severe food insecurity. In dark yellow are the ones in a state of emergency. And now in light yellow, the areas experiencing food shortages. Now, the next map forecasts how the humanitarian situation will evolve between June to September 2024. The deterioration of access to food is devastating. To help us comprehend the humanitarian challenges, I'm joined by Claire Nicolet, Head of Emergency at the Doctors Without Borders for Sudan and Eastern Chad. She joins me from Paris. Welcome to Straight Talk Africa, Claire. Okay. Now, if you may just help us understand, we're talking about 6.6 million people displaced internally within Sudan. From what you know, from your people on the ground, how can we describe the living conditions of those millions of people who are displaced?
So unfortunately, the situation is really getting worse and worse because already the population who has been displaced, they were lacking the really basics, healthcare, food, water. They were really living in poor conditions for most of them and very poor humanitarian access. But unfortunately, the situation is getting worse because most of them moving again and again. So we saw various displacement. For instance, at the beginning of the war, people left massively from Khartoum to One Medani in Jazeera State. But after that, there was a new movement of this same population moving again outside of One Medani because of the fighting. So we can see that this population, most of them, they move again and again. And of course, every time they became more vulnerable, not moving with anything almost. And so the situation is getting really super difficult for them.
Mm-hmm. Now, if we zero in just on the health needs of these people, you know, I see a mix of people in the population, demographics there. We have children, we have older people, we have women and men. Can you share with us what are some of the challenges that MSF is, Doctors Without Borders are facing as they try to meet the needs of those displaced people?
So unfortunately, we have lots of challenges. Really, this response inside Sudan it's such a great challenge. Because first of all, we have lots of difficulties, administrative difficulties to move things and to move our teams to the place where we need to have really access. So this has been a major difficulty. Now the supply itself is a challenge because the roads are not very easy to use because of fighting, because of the reality of the roads. Of course, we just discussed before about the rainy season arriving. It will be even a bigger challenge. So this is make really quite difficult for us as a humanitarian aid NGO and healthcare NGO to really access the population. There are lots of outbreaks at the moment. Unfortunately, we are entering in the worst moment in terms of malnutrition, malaria. So even this moment is a bit more quiet than what we will face in the coming weeks and months.
Yes.
Food has been a major challenge. So we are very also worried of the nutrition situation because food is not getting to the population so far.
Yes, and we know that all those things are interrelated. The food, there's a medical dimension to that. I want us to bring up the map we just had before, and so you can help us kind of break down to, you know, what those areas that have been identified in red, for example, mean, and then we have those that are a little bit more in dark yellow. Can you describe the red part of the map where it says that they experience severe food insecurity? What does that mean?
So it means that really almost this population, they have no access for 1 year to food. So because of the trucks not moving and food not being distributed and very few actors being on the ground for treating malnutrition, because when you have lack of food, most of the time, fortunately, you have some actors who manage to get some, at least taking into consideration the situation, they can already treat malnutrition. These people, basically, they are lacking any kind of food, and it means that, of course, mortality directly linked to nutrition will be very striking for this population living in these red areas. So that's really something that it's coming really now to these regions, and it means that population, maybe they cannot move anymore, and really we will face high mortality because of the situation of just not having food.
Do we have a danger of some of the areas that are actually colored in yellow, which are experiencing serious food shortages, but not to the severity of the areas marked red? Do we have those yellows turning into red, perhaps in the coming months?
Definitely, because the trucks, they won't be able to get access to this region. So unfortunately, month by month, it will deteriorate. There are very few food on this harvesting season. So normally at this period, it's a bit good. Unfortunately, we see that there is already a very high malnutrition in all these areas we are seeing in dark yellow and in red. And so month by month, it will deteriorate. And unfortunately, we don't see provision of a big distribution, food distribution, because of lack of access, because of lack of preparation. And unfortunately, with this rainy season coming, yes, definitely some regions, they will continue to enter in this red zone.
So let's talk about some of the pledges that have been made over time by the international community. Are you getting what you need on the ground, despite of the fact that you're unable to deliver sometimes because of logistics and insecurity, but are you getting what you need?
So no, unfortunately, the pledges are there, but the reality on the ground, there are not enough funding for the Sudanese crisis. And Sudanese crisis is not one-off. It means that it's a very specific and strong major crisis of the moment. So we heard about displacement. It's the major displacement crisis at the moment. And today's Sudan is seen as if people already know that there is still a crisis, even if the crisis is known, unfortunately, no, we are even considering this like if it was a small crisis, it's a major one, and the funding is really, really needed, not just for the neighboring countries who are receiving refugees, and of course they need some funding for there, but for inside Sudan, and for really the different actors to be present there and be able to really respond to this massive situation, large-scale humanitarian crisis that we are facing inside Sudan.
Now, very quickly, there's a time that MSF actually withdrew from Wad Madani after saying that there was a lot of harassment. Are you back there? Are there areas where you're not able to go actually, and therefore the people are just left to hopefully, survive?
So unfortunately, there are some areas like this that even MSF, where we are quite strong presence inside all Sudan, but there are even some areas we cannot stay, and we have to also discuss a lot with the different warring parties to be able to operate. So this is a very difficult situation that all the actors are facing. And definitely there are some people who are receiving zero help at the moment, unfortunately.
Oh, thanks for your time. We'll have to leave it right there. Thank you very much for being on the show. Claire Nicolet, Chief of Doctors Without Borders Emergency Response in Sudan. Thanks to our affiliate stations for broadcasting Straight Talk Africa across the continent. I'll see you next time.